Hi class, this is the 8th video and the final video in the series, Introduction to Literary Theory, and the topic of this video is introducing ecocriticism, which is covered in chapter 10 of our textbook, Theory into Practice. This is a picture of the ruins of the Roman city of Pompeii. You see Mount Vesuvius smoking in the background there. It erupted in the year 79 and wiped out an entire city. So a relationship between human beings and the environment that did not go well. Here are some tourists sitting at the top at the overlooking the blast crater. Don't know if I'd want to be sitting there myself, but you can still go up there today, actually. So the term ecocriticism was first used in the late 1970s, and not all environmental critics approve of this term. Lawrence Buell, whom we'll talk about later, didn't like this word. He thought it was sort of a pejorative word with some negative connotations to it. But it's the word that our text uses, so we're going to stick with it. It was first used in the late 1970s to identify a relatively new approach to literary texts that focuses less on the aesthetic or linguistic and cultural questions addressed by some of the other theoretical models that we've looked at, and focuses more on the relationship between human beings and their natural environment. And this involves much more than questions of genre or setting, more than the appreciation of the beauties of nature. It means understanding how the environment, how the natural world has shaped human civilization, and also the impact human beings have had and continue to have on the environment. So whereas other theoretical approaches focus on unequal relationships of power between social groups like the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or patriarchy and women, colonialism and colonial subjects, and so forth, ecocriticism draws attention to the way humanity, just as a whole, dominates, exploits, and destroys the natural world, drawing evidence from how writers portray that world in their works. So I'll just introduce you to a few of the prominent voices in the field of ecocriticism. This is Rachel Carson. The genealogy of ecocriticism can be traced to all the way back to the 19th century and transcendentalist writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Fuller, Henry David Thoreau, but also more recent writers like Rachel Carson. And her book, Silent Spring, is a landmark study of the destruction caused by the overuse of pesticides like DDT. And this book helped to launch the modern environmentalist movement. And by the end of the decade, by the end of the 1960s, there were a number of very influential environmental advocacy groups. And the federal government under President Nixon, created the Environmental Protection Agency. Rachel Carson was an English major, by the way, and she quotes John Keats and other romantic poets in Silent Spring. Another really influential book early in the history of this movement, The Comedy of Survival: Studies in Literary Ecology by Joseph Meeker. This is one of the earliest books to use environmentalism as a lens to read literary works. The book looks at specifically the genres of comedy and tragedy for what they tell us about humanity's relationship with the natural world. Meeker looks at some plays by Shakespeare. Hamlet is one of them. I can't remember the others. Remember Hamlet definitely talks about. By the way, the scene that you see here is called the Mer de Glace, the Sea of Ice, in Switzerland, a glacier that was a popular tourist spot. Still is today, but part of Frankenstein is set here, and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein has become a popular work for eco-critics in recent years. So this is Cheryl Glattfeldt. She was enormously influential as a writer, organizer, and leader in the field of eco-criticism. She's retired now. She was a professor at the University of Nevada in Reno, which today is the home base for the Center for Environmental Arts and Humanities, and she was very instrumental in all of that. And this is a book that she co-edited called The Ecocriticism Reader, which contains a lot of really important. It's like an anthology of important works in eco-criticism. That came out in 1996. Another influential voice, Lawrence Buell, Harvard professor, who wrote this book, The Environmental Imagination, in 1991, which focuses on the American Transcendental Movement, Henry David Thoreau in particular. And he published a number of influential books in eco-criticism. Here's another one, Writing for an Endangered World, in 2001. And one more writer worth mentioning here, Jonathan Bate, who is British and wrote this book, Romantic Ecology, which was an early eco-critical work that focused on the British Romantic poets. So Glattfeldt explains that eco-criticism has three focal points. One of them, she says, is representations of nature. And then there's nature writing, sort of nonfiction writing in there. And then the area of philosophy and praxis. And we'll talk about each of these three briefly. We'll start with representations. So in the same way feminist critics examine how women are portrayed in literature, or post-colonial critics how Eurocentric attitudes shape perceptions of colonial subjects, eco-criticism focuses on how authors represent nature in their writings, not simply in terms of world-building description, like setting and sort of describing the beauties of nature, but also their understanding of how human beings coexist and interact with nature. And so critics examine what the representations of the natural world reveal about the writers as well as their readers' attitudes toward environmental issues. So nature writing and nonfiction writing. So in addition to canonical texts, like the writings of the American Transcendentalists or British Romantic poets or Meeker's writing about Renaissance playwrights, environmental critics turn to non-literary texts and cultural objects as well, especially works of nonfiction prose, like essays like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, for example, or travelogues and even personal letters. The literariness of a work is always secondary to environmental concerns. And finally, philosophy and praxis. So beyond literary criticism, eco-criticism addresses philosophical questions about our relationship with the natural world and where that relationship is headed. Is human culture, for example, natural or unnatural? And what are the implications to the answers to those questions? And what kinds of action or praxis should we take to redirect or preserve that relationship? For example, in the textbook, we learn about the so-called light greens who advocate a moderate political position focused on conservation, whereas the more radical dark greens call for a complete return to nature. So eco-criticism broadens the debate about about humanity and about the environment beyond just works of literature and cultural production. And that concludes this video introducing eco-criticism with a nice painting of an iceberg by Frederick Church.